get us started here. I'm going second, and I will hopefully be able to share my slides as well. I had to turn them into a PDF because Bizzabo hates Keynote, so they're not as jazzy as my slides normally are for those of you who have seen me present before, so apologies for that. And I promise also to keep myself on time. I have my phone here yelling at me. Okay, so first I want to say hello and thank you for coming to the panel, and also thank you to the conference organizers and the tech support help that we've already had in the room. So again, thank you for that. I also wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I live and work on, who are the Yagara and Turrbal people here in the Brisbane region, and to acknowledge their elders past and present, and also to acknowledge that this land was never ceded. So this paper is part of a larger project, as is the case for basically everyone at ISA. And so that larger project looks at online and offline realms as porous, parallel, and overlapping. I use the terms online and offline because their implied rigidity and separation underlies current understandings of what the internet is and what role the internet plays in political life. I use the term internet to specifically refer to the overlaps and intersections between these two worlds. And in this paper specifically, and in the project more broadly, I challenge this rigidity and in its place offer a spatial model that focuses on the intersections of online and offline in which actors and forces intersect in new and potentially productive ways. These intersections are not mere portals or doorways. Rather, as I discuss in more detail elsewhere, online and offline spaces are assemblages with porous boundaries, whose transversal overlaps contain and constitute heterotopic spacetimes with ties back to both online and offline worlds. So in this talk, as you might have gathered from the title, I'm focusing on the way that I use fiction as part of my method in this project and in my work more broadly. And I use fiction in a variety of forms in ways that are critical to my theorizing process. So for me, in this particular part of this project, the key point is that the fictional texts that I use often highlight these intersections that I'm interested in through exaggeration. And in the exaggeration, such text acts as magnifying reflections of the times and spaces in which they were written and our present. So I look at these texts in their own context, so when they were originally written, but also looking at them in the present and reading the present through them. And so I'll explain this through a brief example. Of course, there's more detail in the paper. So in this section of my project, I use 3 fictional texts in combination with Foucault's work on the heterotopia to conceptualize these overlaps between worlds more generally, and then look at the internet more specifically. So the first text that I use is Pwyll, which is a medieval Welsh story, and I'd be happy to come back to that one during the discussion. In this particular paper, I focus on the latter 2 of the 3 texts, which are a short story by Herman Melville called The Two Temples, and China Miéville's novel, The City and the City. Both texts deal explicitly with notions of authority and how societies manifest systems of authority in heterotopias. Humans have always been at home in and shaped by transversal spaces, in which nothing is truly segregated, unsullied, or natural. And in this presentation, I'll focus primarily on Miéville's novel For Time. So my conceptual work here started with Foucault's concept of the heterotopia, which I used to develop a theory of overlapping online and offline worlds in order to examine the emergent consequences of the internet and the current ways that we talk about and understand it. So Foucault developed this concept in his piece Of Other Spaces, but for my purposes, this concept can be expanded upon and challenged by placing Foucault alongside these fictional texts. And this process of imbrication reveals a number of tools or procedures that I then use in my later analyses of things like memes and hashtags. Each of these fictional texts plays with overlapping spaces, exposing the multidimensionality of space-time, how particular protocols navigate overlapping or juxtaposed spaces, and how the multitude of actors involved generate and maintain these overlapping heterotopic spaces. So Foucault introduces the concept of the heterotopia as spaces organized and imbricated in different trajectories of time. Unlike fictional utopias, heterotopias are divergent collisions of space-time within a given epoch. If, as Foucault writes, our epoch is one in which space takes for us the form of relations among sites, then heterotopias are something like countersites, a kind of effectively enacted utopia in which the real sites are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. While his definition at first glance appears counterintuitive, Foucault is trying to theorize spaces that ought not exist, but which do persist nevertheless. The complexity of this concept requires significant scrutiny, and in the paper, I go through all 6 principles, which I've included a shorthand of here on the slide. But in this presentation, I'm going to focus just on the 1st and the 5th as an example of how I do this work. So according to Foucault's first principle, it is difficult to imagine a culture that doesn't generate heterotopias in the constitution of itself as a culture. However, heterotopias are not a universal theory of resistance. Instead, heterotopias take quite varied forms. And I see 3 key aspects in this first principle: that they're immanent to cultures, that they are universal but not general, and that they're common through space-time. So whether you're looking at a fictional world or a particular period of time from the real world, you're likely to find heterotopias. The way that heterotopias are tied to culture, however, is more complex than was indicated by Foucault. Heterotopias are often negotiated between multiple societies and often involve non-human actors. Since Foucault describes heterotopias as being constituted by a culture, it is a short step to think of a heterotopia as revelatory of the culture and other agents that generate it. The fictional heterotopias I discuss here not only reveal aspects of the cultures presented in the stories themselves, but they're also reflective of the broader political context in which they were written. And by studying these fictional heterotopias, I also gain insights into how heterotopias function more generally, and I then use these insights in my study of the internet. So the 5th principle, which describes heterotopias as, quote, always presupposing a system of opening and closing that both isolates them and makes them penetrable, unquote, constitutes the most visible aspect of most heterotopias. In this principle, I include the protocols required to cross into and to function within heterotopias. So this looks at questions like, what must be done to enter or leave a heterotopic space? Further, are there protocols that sort of put boundaries around how you act and what you must do within that heterotopic space? Also important to this principle is the way that the border functions to make the heterotopia visible or invisible, sensible or insensible. Protocols can be found in the medieval society depicted in Puig, in which the rules determining interactions between those of higher and lower status form a key plot point. Protocol, however, also has a special meaning in the heterotopic interactions of online and offline worlds, in the sense that Alexander Galloway uses it in his discussions of the internet, which again, I'd be happy to come back to during the Q&A. So I discussed both of these principles in the paper's section on China Miéville's novel, The City in the City. And so I want to look briefly at some of that discussion now. So The City in the City is set in a fictional city of Miéville's own creation, but it does have a distinctly Eastern European atmosphere. And as with the first paper, there are some spoiler warnings here, but pretty minimal, because I'm talking at a more sort of abstract level. And in this particular analysis, I don't deal so much with the plot. Okay, so in a singular geographic space, there are 2 recognized cities, Bejol and Ulcoma, and the possibility of a 3rd city, Orsini. These 2 or 3 cities have a complex relationship with each other. Any given space within the geographical confines of the cities can exist in either Bejol or Ulcoma, or both or neither, and thus maybe in Orsini. All of the citizens of each city, as well as visitors, must constantly perform the borders as they move through the area. They must unsee, unhear, untaste, and generally unnotice any aspect of the other city or cities while they are officially in any one of them. As in Puig, City places a lot of emphasis on the idea that the overlapping spaces only function because protocols exist and are performed or followed by the actors involved. People must perform the border constantly to both maintain that border and to live their lives within their own city while overlapping with the other. Moreover, when a person needs to travel to the other city, he or she must perform still more protocols to navigate through Copula Hall, perhaps the most complexly heterotopic space in the novel. The environments themselves must also reinforce and follow these protocols, with particular architectural styles, colors, and fonts acting as markers. Even when these markers are played with, as in one of the quotes here on the slide, the intricacies of the protocols are followed. These coded differences are used as clues for the performance of the border that cannot be drawn cleanly on a map. So finally, as in both Puig and Temples, the heterotopias, the overlapping spaces in the city, present a challenge to Foucault's notion of heterotopias as spaces fashioned by individual agentic societies. In the city, there are at least two and perhaps three societies that in some way constitute the heterotopia that encompasses the geographic area. As already mentioned, individuals, both members of the various societies involved and outsiders, are constantly reinscribing or challenging the structure, protocols, and functions of the various overlapping spaces. Mieville also repeatedly emphasizes the role of breach, which is the security force that punishes and eliminates those who do not perform the border between the cities properly. Furthermore, Mieville mentions the role of non-human players, like the river that runs through the city in the constitution of the space. The river is a space of movement of goods and people. In the timescale of the novel, the river does not change its course, but its relationships with Ulcoma and Bejel shift as the activity of each city changes over time. So it is not a single agentic society or even a grouping of societies that generates a heterotopia, but rather an assemblage of human and non-human actors at various scales that interact, and out of that interaction, these overlapping spaces emerge and function. So now I'm to my concluding points. Through these fictional texts, certain characteristics of heterotopic spaces have emerged that define my conceptualization of space and space-time. These are the role of protocol, the presence of flux or change, distributed agency, multidimensional space-time, and the multidirectional flow of cause and effect. These characteristics make the heterotopic assemblages I explore throughout the project critical in two ways. First, I see these characteristics at play in the world, and ignoring them can make it difficult to understand or take into consideration the role the internet, for example, has in politics. Second, these aspects, particularly the role of protocol and the effects of distributed agency, create opportunities for disenfranchised groups to make their challenges to existing power structures more effective. In these texts, however, one can also find forces and actors that can challenge and in some instances dismantle these heterotopic characteristics by shoring up traditional boundaries, like breach in the city, or by reinscribing dominant power structures and binaries like the beetle-faced man in the Two Temples. These characteristics, based on Foucault's original theory and expanded through these textual analyses, guide my examination of the internet and the rest of the project. And I will leave it there. Normally I'd have a fun GIF here, but it's flattened, so less fun. Okay, so up next we have Shannon.